They said the night shift at the train yard was just mechanical work. They lied. Out here, after midnight, there are unspoken rules that keep you alive and keep phantom trains running on schedule. Miss one, and you don't make it to sunrise. The Blackwood Junction train yard stretches across 47 acres of rust and shadow, a skeletal network of steel rails that glint like knife edges under the pale moonlight. During the day, it's a hub of ordinary commerce, diesel engines pulling freight cars loaded with timber, coal, and containerized goods destined for cities hundreds of miles away. But when the sun dips below the horizon and the day shift clocks out, something fundamental changes in the air itself. The temperature drops several degrees more than weather patterns can explain. The shadows grow longer, darker, more substantial, and the men and women who work the graveyard shift from midnight until dawn move with a different kind of awareness, a heightened alertness that has nothing to do with workplace safety regulations. Daniel Brennan learned this on his very first night. He'd taken the job 3 weeks ago, desperate for the pay differential that came with nocturnal hours. 23 years old, fresh out of technical school with certifications in diesel mechanics and railway systems, he'd thought he understood what he was getting into. The hiring manager, a weathered man named Vincent Corso, with eyes like chips of flint, had been surprisingly direct during the interview. "The work is standard maintenance and operations," Corso had said, his voice carrying an edge that made Daniel sit up straighter. "But the night shift has its own culture, its own way of doing things. You follow what the senior workers tell you. No questions, no exceptions. Understood?" Daniel had nodded, assuming Corso meant the usual workplace hierarchy, the kind of unwritten rules that exist in any blue-collar environment. He couldn't have been more wrong. His first shift began at 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes early as instructed. The transition between shifts happened in the break room, a cinder block structure with fluorescent lights that hummed with an electrical whine. The day shift workers filed out quickly, barely making eye contact, their relief at leaving palpable in every hurried step. The night crew filtered in slowly, deliberately, like soldiers preparing for a deployment into hostile territory. There were 7 of them in total: Corso, the shift supervisor, 2 veteran rail workers named James Hartley and Raymond Cross, both in their 50s with the kind of weathered faces that spoke of decades under open sky. A young woman named Isabel Reyes who handled the control booth operations. 2 maintenance workers, brothers called simply the Kowalskis, who rarely spoke at all. And now Daniel, the newest addition, the one who didn't yet understand. "Listen carefully," Corso said, once the door had shut behind the last day shift worker. His voice dropped to something just above a whisper, and everyone leaned in instinctively. "The official rules are simple. Maintain the equipment, monitor the automated switching systems, perform safety checks, log all freight movements." He paused, and the silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Whispering. Daniel felt his skin prickle at the word, though he couldn't explain why. Hartley spoke next, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and cold night air. "There are trains that come through this yard that aren't on any schedule, locomotives that don't appear in any database, cars that carry cargo no manifest ever recorded. And there are rules, unofficial rules, that govern how we interact with them, how we survive them." "This is insane," Daniel said, the words escaping before he could stop them. The room went absolutely silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to stop their humming for a moment. Isabel Reyes spoke for the first time, her voice soft but carrying an undertone of steel. 3 years ago, we had a new guy. Smart, confident, a lot like you. He said the same thing, laughed at the rules, called them superstitious nonsense. She pulled out her phone, swiped through several screens, then turned it to face Daniel. The image showed a young man's face, smiling in what looked like an ID photo. His name was Thomas Webb. He worked exactly 4 night shifts before he disappeared. Disappeared? Daniel's mouth had gone dry. They found his hard hat near track 17, Raymond Cross added quietly. Nothing else. No body, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just the hat, sitting perfectly centered on the rail, like someone had placed it there deliberately. The official report said he must have fallen from a moving train, got dragged away somehow, though there were no trains scheduled through that section that night. He leaned forward, his eyes catching the harsh overhead light. But we know better. We know exactly what happened to him. Corso stood, ending the conversation with the authority of someone who'd had this discussion too many times before. The rules exist for a reason. They were written in blood, learned through tragedy, passed down through generations of night shift workers. You can believe in them or not. That's your choice. But you will follow them, every single one, without exception, without deviation, because the moment you don't, he gestured toward the darkness visible through the break room's single grimy window. The moment you think you know better, the yard claims you, just like it claimed Thomas Webb, just like it's claimed dozens of others over the decades. Outside, somewhere in the vast network of rails and switches, a train whistle blew. But it wasn't the sharp, mechanical sound of a modern diesel horn. It was something older, more mournful, a sound that seemed to carry centuries of sorrow in its echoing wail. Daniel felt every hair on his body stand on end. The graveyard shift had begun. The history of Blackwood Junction stretches back to 1887, when the transcontinental railway expansion pushed through this remote valley, transforming wilderness into a critical junction point for 3 major rail lines. The official records speak of engineering triumphs and economic growth, of steel rails conquering impossible terrain, of progress marching inexorably forward. But the unofficial history, the one whispered between workers during long night shifts, tells a different story altogether. Corso led Daniel out into the yard proper, their boots crunching on gravel that seemed unnaturally loud in the midnight stillness. The massive freight cars loomed on either side like the walls of a canyon, their shadowed hulks creating corridors of darkness that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the scattered work lights. Above them, the sky was a starless void, clouds obscuring the moon and creating a claustrophobic sense of enclosure despite the open space. The first deaths happened during construction, Corso said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. 73 men died building this junction. Cave-ins, explosions, equipment failures, diseases. The official number is 22, but we know better. The company buried the real count along with the bodies. He stopped at a junction point where 3 sets of rails converged, forming a complex web of switches and crossings. This spot right here, 12 men were crushed when a temporary support structure collapsed. They were buried in a mass grave about 50 yards north, under what's now the diesel fuel depot. Daniel looked toward the fuel depot, a squat concrete structure with warning signs plastered across its walls. Nothing about it suggested the presence of human remains beneath its foundation, yet something about Corso's matter-of-fact delivery made the claim feel horrifyingly credible. The superintendent at the time was a man named Elijah Blackwood, same family the junction's named after, Corso continued, walking again, leading Daniel deeper into the maze of rails and machinery. He was obsessed with keeping the construction on schedule, no matter the cost. Workers who complained about safety were fired on the spot, sometimes beaten and left in the wilderness miles from civilization. There's a documented case of 3 union organizers who came through in 1889 trying to rally the workers for better conditions. They boarded a train heading east and were never seen again. The official story is they got off at some other junction, but the conductors all told a different tale. "What tale?" asked Daniel, though part of him didn't want to know. They said the 3 men were pulled off the train between stations in the middle of the night while the locomotive was moving at full speed, pulled off by hands that reached out from the darkness itself, from places where no one could possibly stand. Corso's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. The conductors reported seeing shapes moving alongside the train, keeping pace despite impossible speeds, and hearing screams that were cut off with terrible finality. They reached the oldest section of the yard, where the original 1887 rails still ran, maintained more out of tradition than practical necessity. The rails here were different from the modern steel, narrower and darker, pitted with age, and scored with marks that could have been rust or could have been something else entirely. A small wooden sign, weathered almost to illegibility, marked the spot: Original Junction Point, Est 1887. "This is where it started," Corso said, and his tone carried a reverence that bordered on religious. "This is where the first whispers were heard." Before Daniel could ask what that meant, a sound drifted through the night air. It was subtle at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, a susurrus that might have been leaves rustling or distant water flowing. But there were no trees nearby, no streams or rivers. The sound grew gradually more distinct, resolving into something that Daniel's blood run cold. Voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all whispering at once in a cacophony of overlapping syllables that never quite formed coherent words. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, emanating from the rails themselves, rising up through the gravel, echoing off the freight cars. And underlying it all was a quality of desperate urgency, as though the voices were trying to communicate something vital, but were forever trapped just beyond the threshold of comprehension. "What is that?" Daniel managed to ask, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound calm. "That's why they call it the Whispering Train Yard," Isabel Reyes said, appearing from behind a freight car with a tablet computer in her hands. She'd been checking the automated systems while Corso conducted the history lesson. "The phenomenon has been documented for over a century. Every recording device picks it up differently. Analog tape captures one set of sounds, digital recorders get another, but human ears hear something else entirely. Some of the old-timers claim they can understand specific words, warnings about cave-ins or equipment failures, though that's never been verified." She pulled up a file on her tablet, showing Daniel a scanned document from 1923. The handwriting was cramped and frantic, barely legible. "This is from the personal journal of the night shift supervisor from that year, a man named Otto Fischer. Read the highlighted section." Daniel took the tablet, squinting at the faded text. "October 17th, 1923. The whispering grows louder each night. The men are terrified. Some refuse to work past midnight. I've begun to distinguish patterns in the chaos, rhythms that repeat every 73 seconds. Tonight, for the first time, I heard my own name spoken clearly among the voices. It knew me. It called to me. God help me. I almost answered." "Fisher disappeared 6 days after writing that entry," Isabel said, taking the tablet back. His replacement lasted 3 weeks before suffering what the company doctor called a complete nervous breakdown. The next supervisor, a pragmatist named Catherine Voss, took a different approach. Instead of trying to understand or resist the phenomenon, she began documenting which behaviors seemed to correlate with safety and which preceded accidents or disappearances. "She created the first version of the rules," Corso interjected. "Voss spent 30 years on the night shift, longer than anyone before or since. She died peacefully in her sleep at age 78, which is in itself remarkable given the typical lifespan of workers from that era. Before she died, she compiled everything she'd learned into a handbook that she passed to her successor. That handbook has been updated and refined over the decades, but the core principles remain unchanged." They walked past a section of track that had been cordoned off with faded yellow caution tape, though no active work was being done there. The rails in this section were twisted at odd angles, as though something impossibly strong had wrenched them from their proper alignment. Daniel noticed that none of the night crew walked within 10 feet of the cordoned area, giving it the same wide berth they might give a coiled snake. "What happened there?" he asked. Raymond Cross, who'd been working nearby on a routine inspection, overheard the question. He straightened slowly, his face grim in the harsh worklight. "That's where we lost the last person who openly defied the rules. Woman named Patricia Nguyen, about 8 years ago. Brilliant engineer, graduated top of her class from MIT, came here because she was researching railway safety systems for her doctorate. She thought the rules were folklore, primitive superstitions maintained by uneducated workers. She was going to write a paper debunking them, applying rational scientific analysis to supernatural claims." He walked closer, his shadow stretching long across the gravel. On her 9th night shift, she deliberately violated Rule 7. The exact details don't matter now, but it involved acknowledging something she should have ignored. The rails there buckled instantaneously, despite being inspected and certified just hours before. The metal twisted like it was made of soft clay. Patricia was standing right in the center when it happened. The other workers heard her scream, but by the time anyone reached the spot, she was gone. No trace except for her glasses, crushed flat against one of the twisted rails. Daniel felt his skepticism warring with the mounting evidence, the accumulation of stories and strange occurrences that defied easy explanation. Maybe she just ran. Maybe the stress got to her and she abandoned the job. The 3 veteran workers exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge, of experiences that bound them together in ways an outsider couldn't comprehend. "Her car was still in the parking lot the next morning," Isabel said quietly. "Her apartment was untouched, her belongings still there, her bank account never accessed again. And 3 days after she vanished, the control booth computer received a message through the automated system. It wasn't in any format we use, wasn't transmitted through any known protocol. The message consisted of a single repeating phrase displayed for exactly 73 seconds before erasing itself completely from the system." "What did it say?" Daniel asked, just as he dreaded the answer. Isabel met his eyes with an expression of profound sadness. It said, "She didn't listen. Will you?" At exactly 12:30 a.m., the entire night crew gathered in the maintenance bay, a cavernous structure with high ceilings that echoed every footstep and whispered word. This was where the real training would begin, where Daniel would learn the rules that separated survivors from victims in the whispering train yard. Corso stood before a large whiteboard that had been wheeled out from storage, its surface covered with handwritten text that looked as though it had been erased and rewritten countless times over the years. "There are 13 primary rules," Corso began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Some seem logical, others appear arbitrary, but every single one was learned through tragedy. You will memorize them tonight. You will follow them without hesitation. Your life depends on literal obedience. He pointed to the first rule written in bold red marker at the top of the board. Rule 1. Never acknowledge the phantom cars directly. If you see a freight car that appears on no manifest, that bears no company markings or identification numbers, you do not approach it, you do not inspect it, you do not speak about it while it's present. You continue with your assigned tasks as though it doesn't exist. Corso's finger moved down the list. Last year, we had a contractor who thought this was ridiculous. He walked right up to a phantom car, tried to photograph it for what he called documentation purposes. The photograph showed nothing but empty track, but the man's camera was found shattered into pieces so small they looked like they'd been ground by industrial machinery. The contractor wasn't found at all. James Hartley stepped forward, pulling out a worn leather notebook from his jacket pocket. I've worked this yard for 27 years. I've seen phantom cars exactly 43 times. I've documented each occurrence, though the documentation has to be done from memory after the fact, because any attempt to record them in real time results in equipment failure or worse. The phantom cars appear most frequently on track 17, which happens to run directly over the site of that 1887 mass burial. They're always older models, pre-1950s designs, covered in a rust that seems to move and shift when you're not looking directly at it. Daniel found his voice, though it came out rougher than he'd intended. What's inside them? The phantom cars? What are they carrying? The room went silent for a long moment. Finally, Raymond Cross answered, his voice barely above a whisper. Nothing you want to see, nothing that should exist in this world. The few times someone's gotten close enough to peer through the gaps in the walls, they've reported cargo that defies description. Shapes that hurt to look at, containers that seem larger on the inside than the car itself, and sounds, endless sounds of movement and breathing from things that shouldn't be alive. Corso moved to the second rule, tapping it firmly. Rule 2. Always maintain a light source in the abandoned control booth. The old booth on the north end was decommissioned in 1998 when we built the new automated facility, but you'll notice it always has lights burning inside. That's not an accident, that's deliberate. If those lights ever go out, you drop whatever you're doing and get them back on immediately. Battery backup, generator, flashlights, it doesn't matter. Light in that structure must be constant. Why? Daniel asked, unable to stop himself. Isabel Reyes pulled up a video file on a portable screen, grainy security footage from 2003. This is what happened the one time the lights failed. Electrical storm knocked out power for 47 minutes before the backup generators kicked in. Watch the timestamp. The footage showed the dark silhouette of the abandoned control booth, barely visible against the night sky. At the 30-minute mark of the outage, something began to emerge from the structure. At first, it looked like smoke or fog, but it moved with deliberate purpose, flowing down the steps and across the gravel in a thick stream. Where it passed, the security camera's image warped and distorted, creating gaps in the visual record. And then, at the edges of the frame, the footage captured something that made Daniel's stomach lurch. Figures, human-shaped but wrong, moving in ways that violated basic physics, their limbs bending at impossible angles, their movements simultaneously too fast and too slow to track properly. They spread out across the yard, approaching different areas with clear intentionality. 4 workers were on shift that night, Isabel said, her voice tight. 2 of them made it to safety by locking themselves in the diesel maintenance building. The other 2 were outside when the lights went out. We found them the next morning. Physically, they were fine, not a mark on them, but they haven't spoken a coherent word since. Both are in a psychiatric facility now, 11 years later, and all they do is rock back and forth and whisper the same phrase over and over. "What phrase?" Daniel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "We let them out. We let them out. We let them out." Isabel closed the video file. The psychiatrists think it's trauma-induced psychosis. We know better. Whatever those things were, the darkness and the abandoned booth gave them passage into our world. The lights keep the doorway closed. Corso continued methodically through the rules, each one more unsettling than the last. Rule 3. If you hear a train whistle that sounds like human screaming, evacuate to the safe zone immediately. Don't gather your belongings. Don't try to secure equipment. Don't look to see where it's coming from. Run. Rule 4. Never work alone on track 17 after 1 a.m. Always maintain visual contact with at least one other crew member. Rule 5. If the whispering suddenly stops completely, freeze in place and don't move for a full 60 seconds. Movement during the silence draws attention you do not want. Rule 6. The Kowalski brothers have a specific route they walk every night at precisely 2:15 a.m. Stay out of their path. Do not speak to them during this walk. Do not ask questions about what they're doing. This one is non-negotiable. Daniel glanced at the Kowalski brothers, who stood silently near the back of the group, their faces expressionless. They were identical twins, though Daniel had never been able to tell them apart, and they possessed an eerie synchronization in their movements that he'd noticed even during his day shift training. Rule 7. If anyone or anything calls your name from beyond the lit perimeter of the work areas, do not respond. Do not acknowledge that you heard it. Do not go to investigate. Tell the shift supervisor immediately. Rule 8. The switching station for Track 9 operates manually only between midnight and 4 a.m. The automated system is disabled during these hours for reasons that predate current management. Do not attempt to re-enable the automation. Rule 9. If you see anyone wearing a railway uniform with the old Blackwood Company logo, the one that was discontinued in 1972, do not interact with them. Report the sighting to the supervisor and avoid that area for the rest of the shift. Hartley interjected here, his voice carrying a note of grim experience. I've seen them 3 times. They look solid, real as you or me. They perform work tasks, inspections, maintenance, but if you watch carefully, you'll notice they cast no shadows under the work lights, and their movements, there's something mechanical about them, like they're following a script they've performed 1,000 times before. Rule 10. Food and drink are consumed only in designated areas. Never eat or drink while actively working on the rails themselves. This isn't about workplace cleanliness, it's about making yourself vulnerable. Rule 11. If equipment fails in a pattern, specifically if 3 separate mechanical systems fail within a 10-minute period, cease all operations and gather in the break room until the pattern breaks. Wait exactly 30 minutes, then resume. Rule 12. The freight elevator to the underground maintenance level operates only between shifts. If it activates during your shift, do not board it. Do not look inside it. Radio the supervisor and evacuate the maintenance bay. Corso's expression darkened as he approached the final rule, written in black marker that had been traced over so many times the letters were embossed into the whiteboard surface. Rule 13. If you encounter yourself, an exact duplicate performing tasks you don't remember doing, do not approach it. Do not speak to it. Immediately alert the entire crew and follow doppelganger protocols, which Isabel will detail separately. This is considered a critical event, and it means something has gone fundamentally wrong with the barrier between what should be and what is. The room fell into heavy silence. Daniel's mind reeled with the implications of everything he'd heard, the systematic documentation of impossible phenomena, the casualties that had resulted from disbelief or carelessness. "These rules have been refined over generations," Corso said finally. "They're not perfect, they don't guarantee safety, but they significantly improve your chances of surviving the night shift. Tomorrow night, assuming you return, we'll cover the minor protocols, the additional guidelines that address more specific situations, but these 13 form the core. Violate them and you're on your own. Follow them and you might just make it to retirement." Outside, in the cold darkness of the train yard, a whistle blew. Not the screaming one from Rule 3, but close enough to make everyone tense. Daniel realized with absolute certainty that his world had fundamentally changed. Daniel's fourth night on the graveyard shift began like the others, with the methodical transition ritual in the break room and the quiet intensity that settled over the crew as midnight approached. But tonight was different. Tonight, he would experience firsthand why the rules existed, why they weren't merely superstitious traditions, but practical survival protocols forged through loss and terror. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sunset, creating a biting cold that seeped through even the insulated work coveralls. Daniel's assignment for the evening was routine maintenance on the switching systems for tracks 5 through 8, working alongside Raymond Cross, whose weathered hands moved with the practiced efficiency of decades of experience. They carried their toolboxes through the maze of rails, their headlamps creating bobbing circles of light that seemed inadequate against the pressing darkness. "Stay close," Raymond said, his breath forming thick clouds. "Track 7 runs parallel to 17 for about 100 yards. We need to be aware of our surroundings." They reached the first switching station, a concrete pillar mounted on a concrete pillar that controlled the rail diversion mechanisms. The work itself was straightforward, replacing worn contacts and testing the electrical connections to ensure proper operation. Daniel focused on the technical aspects, using the familiar routine as an anchor against the creeping unease that had become his constant companion during night shifts. 40 minutes into the work, the whispering started. It began as it always did, barely distinguishable from the wind, a background susurrus that could be easily dismissed as auditory pareidolia. But gradually, inexorably, it grew more distinct, more purposeful. Daniel felt his hands begin to shake as he worked, nearly dropping a wrench. The voices seemed to press against his consciousness, not quite words, but loaded with meaning, with urgency, with warning. "Steady," Raymond said quietly, his own hands never pausing in their work. "Don't acknowledge it. Don't try to understand it. Let it wash over you like white noise." They completed the first switching station and moved to the second, their boots crunching on gravel that seemed unnaturally loud despite the whispering that surrounded them. Daniel's headlamp flickered once, twice, and his heart rate spiked before the light steadied again. He'd been warned about that too, about how equipment behaved differently here, about how batteries drained faster and electronics malfunctioned in patterns that defied troubleshooting. Then Raymond stopped abruptly, his hand shooting out to grip Daniel's shoulder with surprising strength. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look at track 17, 30 yards ahead, but don't turn your head. Use your peripheral vision." Daniel obeyed, keeping his body still while shifting his focus. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar silhouette of rails and gravel stretching into darkness. Then, slowly, as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. A freight car that hadn't been there when they'd walked past 15 minutes ago. It sat on track 17 like it had materialized from nothing. An old-style boxcar with wooden sides and metal corners that gleamed dully in the scattered work lights. A phantom car, his first one. The rational part of Daniel's mind screamed that this was impossible, that freight cars didn't simply appear out of thin air, that there had to be a logical explanation. But that part of his mind was rapidly being overruled by the primal instinct that recognized genuine danger, the same evolutionary mechanism that had kept humans alive for millennia by respecting threats they didn't fully understand. "Rule 1, Raymond breathed. "We continue our work. We don't acknowledge it. We don't approach it." They turned back to the switching station. But now every movement felt loaded with danger, every sound amplified. Daniel's hands trembled as he tested electrical connections, and he had to force himself to breathe steadily, to maintain the appearance of normalcy. The phantom car sat there, silent and malevolent, radiating a wrongness that made his skin crawl. Minutes stretched like hours. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and for a terrible moment, Daniel thought he could distinguish actual words within the chaos, syllables that might have been his name. He bit down hard on his tongue, using physical pain to anchor himself against the temptation to turn, to look directly at the impossible car, to break Rule 1. Raymond's radio crackled to life, Corso's voice emerging through heavy static. "All crews be advised. Phantom activity on track 17. Maintain protocols. Do not deviate from assigned tasks." "Copy that," Raymond replied, his voice remarkably steady. "We're finishing up at Station 2, moving to 3 in approximately 10 minutes. They completed their work with agonizing slowness, each test and adjustment performed with meticulous care. Daniel's peripheral vision kept tracking the phantom car, and he could have sworn it was closer than before, though it hadn't appeared to move. Distance itself seemed unreliable near it, perspective warping in ways that made his eyes hurt. Finally, mercifully, they finished the switching station and began walking towards Station 3, which would take them away from track 17 and the impossible freight car. They'd covered maybe 20 yards when Daniel's headlamp died completely, plunging him into darkness so absolute it felt physical, pressing against his face like a suffocating blanket. "Don't panic," Raymond said immediately, his own light swinging around to illuminate Daniel. "Equipment failure is normal here. Use your backup." Daniel fumbled for the backup flashlight clipped to his belt, his fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline. The moment his light came back on, his beam swept across track 17, and what he saw made his blood freeze. The phantom car's door was open. Not just ajar, but fully open, revealing an interior that shouldn't exist within the confined dimensions of a freight car. The space inside seemed to extend impossibly far back, disappearing into a darkness that looked almost liquid, that seemed to move and pulse with its own hideous life. And standing in that doorway, silhouetted against the impossible depths, was a figure. It was human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, its limbs hanging at angles that violated anatomy. And even from 30 yards away, even in the inadequate light, Daniel could see that it was looking directly at him. Don't acknowledge it, Raymond hissed urgently, grabbing Daniel's arm and physically turning him away. Rule 1, Daniel, Rule 1. They walked with forced steadiness toward Station 3, every instinct screaming at Daniel to run, to get away from whatever was watching them from the phantom car. The air had grown noticeably colder, his breath now coming in ragged clouds, and the whispering had reached a fever pitch, hundreds of voices layering over each other in discordant urgency. Behind them, from the direction of track 17, came a sound that Daniel would never forget. It started as a scraping, metal on metal, like something heavy being dragged across rails. Then it evolved into something worse, a rhythmic thumping that could have been footsteps, impossibly heavy footsteps, getting closer. Do not run, Raymond commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its low volume. We maintain our pace, we reach the safe zone, we follow protocol. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied now by a breathing sound that no human throat could produce, a wet, rasping inhalation that seemed to suck the warmth from the air itself. Daniel's legs felt like they might collapse, his entire body screaming with the need to flee, but Raymond's grip on his arm kept him moving at that maddeningly steady pace. They were 15 yards from the designated safe zone, a circle of work lights that formed a protective perimeter. 10 yards, 5. The footsteps were directly behind them now, so close that Daniel could feel displaced air, could smell something acrid and wrong, like burning hair mixed with rotting vegetation. They crossed into the lit perimeter, and the moment they did, everything stopped. The footsteps ceased instantly, the whispering cut off mid-syllable, the oppressive cold lifted as though someone had flipped a switch. Daniel spun around, his flashlight and Raymond's headlamp illuminating the area they'd just traversed. Nothing. Empty tracks, undisturbed gravel, no sign of the phantom car or the figure that had emerged from it, or the thing that had pursued them. Track 17 sat quiet and innocent, indistinguishable from any other section of rail in the yard. That's why we have safe zones, Raymond said quietly, his face pale despite his steady voice. That's why we have the rules. Whatever exists here, whatever shares this space with us, it can't cross certain boundaries. The lit perimeters, the break room, the maintenance bay. As long as we follow protocol, as long as we respect the rules, we can survive. Daniel's legs finally gave out, and he sat heavily on a tool chest, his entire body shaking with reaction. What was that? What would have happened if we'd run, if we'd acknowledged it? Raymond was silent for a long moment, staring out at the dark rails. I've seen it happen twice. New workers who panicked, who broke protocol. The first one started running, tried to make it to the parking lot. We found him the next morning on track 17, sitting perfectly upright, eyes open, no visible injuries. Heart attack, the official report said, though he was 24 years old and in perfect health. The second one looked back, made eye contact with something she shouldn't have. She started screaming, wouldn't stop, had to be physically restrained and removed from the yard. 3 days later, she walked into traffic. The police report said suicide, but her roommate told me something different. She told me that her friend kept saying something was inside her now, that it had gotten in through her eyes when she looked back, that it was wearing her like clothes. He turned to face Daniel, his expression grave. The rules aren't about understanding. They're not about believing or disbelieving. They're about survival. You follow them because the alternative is worse than death. You follow them because what exists here doesn't play by our rules, our physics, our logic, and the only weapon we have against it is the accumulated wisdom of everyone who came before us, everyone who survived long enough to pass on what they learned. Corso's voice came through the radio again, this time without static. "Raymond, Daniel, status check. We're secure in Safe Zone 3. Equipment failure resulted in a brief delay, but we maintained protocol. Request permission to proceed to Station 3. Permission granted. Phantom activity has ceased. Resume normal operations." They stood, collected their tools, and continued with the night's work. But Daniel knew he would never be the same person who had walked into Blackwood Junction 3 weeks ago. He'd crossed a threshold, witnessed something that couldn't be explained away or rationalized, and he understood now with terrible clarity that the rules weren't optional suggestions. They were the difference between going home at dawn and becoming another whispered warning for future night crews. 3 months had passed since Daniel's first night on the graveyard shift. 3 months of following the rules with religious devotion, of witnessing phenomena that should have been impossible, of learning to exist in a world where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred with disturbing regularity. He'd become one of them now, one of the veterans who spoke in hushed tones and moved through the darkness with wary confidence, who understood that survival was about respect rather than courage. The yard had claimed 2 more workers during that time, though neither had been from the night crew. A day shift supervisor who decided to work late, staying past midnight to complete paperwork, had violated Rule 7 without knowing it existed. They'd found him in the abandoned control booth the next morning, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, dead from what the coroner ruled as a massive stroke. A contractor doing electrical work had encountered his own doppelganger, Rule 13's nightmare made manifest, and had made the fatal mistake of approaching it. He'd simply vanished, his tools left abandoned mid-task, his truck still in the parking lot. The night crew had grown tighter, bound together by shared experience and mutual dependence. Daniel had learned the rhythms of the yard, the ebb and flow of supernatural activity, the subtle signs that indicated when danger was heightened and when brief windows of relative safety opened. He'd learned that the rules weren't static, that they evolved slowly over time as new phenomena emerged and new protocols were developed in response. Tonight, Daniel was working with Isabel Reyes in the control booth, monitoring the automated systems while she conducted routine maintenance on the computers. The new control booth was one of the safe zones, its constant lighting and electromagnetic shielding providing protection for most of the yard's more aggressive inhabitants. Through the wide windows, they could see the entire junction spread out below them, a geometric network of rails and machinery illuminated by scattered work lights that created islands of visibility in an ocean of darkness. "You've adapted well," Isabel said, her fingers moving across the keyboard as she ran diagnostic programs. "Most new workers either quit within 2 weeks or have a breakdown. You've found the balance, learned to live with it." "I'm not sure living with it is the right phrase," Daniel replied, watching as James Hartley conducted an inspection on Track 9, his headlamp a solitary point of light moving with methodical precision. "More like coexisting with it, accepting that this is the reality now." Isabel smiled faintly. "That's actually the same thing, just phrased differently. The key is acceptance without surrender, vigilance without paranoia. The rules give us structure, a framework for navigating something that would otherwise drive us mad." She pulled up a historical database on her screen, scrolling through decades of incident reports and documentation. "I've been researching the yard's history more deeply lately, going through archives that predate digitization. Did you know that the phenomenon isn't unique to Blackwood Junction? There are similar reports from railway yards across the country, across the world really, places where the infrastructure is old enough, where enough lives have been lost, where the barrier between worlds has worn thin. Daniel moved closer to the screen, reading over her shoulder. The reports were disturbingly consistent. Different locations, but identical patterns. Phantom trains, whispered warnings, disappearances, rules developed through tragedy. Why railways specifically? Why not other industries, other infrastructure? That's the question, isn't it? Isabel's expression grew thoughtful. My theory, and it's just speculation, is that it's about liminal spaces. Railways exist between places, connecting point A to point B, but never being destinations themselves. They're transitional by nature, thresholds between here and there. And maybe, in certain circumstances, when enough death and suffering has occurred in these threshold spaces, they become thresholds in a more literal sense, passages between our reality and something else. Before Daniel could respond, Corso's voice came through the radio, urgent and clipped. "All personnel, this is a Code 13 situation. Repeat, Code 13. The Kowalski brothers have reported doppelganger activity on Track 5, implementing lockdown protocols. Immediately. All crews return to nearest safe zone and remain there until all clear is given." Code 13, the most serious designation, indicating that something had gone fundamentally wrong with the delicate equilibrium that allowed humans and the otherworldly to coexist in the yard. Daniel felt his pulse spike as Isabel immediately began executing the lockdown sequence, sealing the control booth's doors and activating additional lighting systems throughout the yard. Through the windows, they watched as the night crew converged on safe zones, moving with practiced efficiency despite the obvious urgency. James Hartley reached the maintenance bay, Raymond Cross made it to Safe Zone 2, and the Kowalski brothers, moving with their characteristic synchronization, headed toward the break room. "There," Isabel said, pointing toward Track 5. "Do you see it?" Daniel strained his eyes against the darkness, and then he saw what she meant. Two figures, identical in every detail, both wearing night crew uniforms with Raymond Cross's ID tags visible even at this distance. They stood about 40 yards apart, facing each other across the rails, perfectly still. But Raymond was already secured in Safe Zone 2, which meant both of these figures were something else, something wearing his appearance like a mask. "Which protocol do we follow for dual doppelgangers?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with tension. "There is no protocol," Isabel replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she documented the event. "This has never happened before. The rules cover encountering your own doppelganger, but two copies of someone else? This is new territory." The two Raymond doppelgangers began moving simultaneously, walking toward each other with mechanical precision. As they drew closer, the work lights near Track 5 began to flicker, and through the control booth's audio system, which picked up sound from throughout the yard, they heard the whispering intensify to a roar, no longer background noise, but a deafening cacophony of overlapping voices. "It's a breach," Isabel breathed, horror dawning in her expression. "Whatever keeps them separate from us, whatever barrier the rules help maintain, it's weakening." The two Raymond doppelgangers met in the center of Track 5, and for a moment nothing happened. Then they reached out simultaneously, their hands touching, and reality itself seemed to ripple outward from that point of contact. The rails on Track 5 buckled and twisted, not from any physical force, but from something more fundamental, as though the laws of physics had temporarily suspended operation in that specific location. And then the doppelgangers merged, flowing together like liquids, their forms blending and reshaping into something that was no longer even remotely human. The thing that emerged from their union was tall, impossibly tall, with too many limbs arranged in configurations that hurt to look at directly. It turned slowly, surveying the yard with whatever passed for its sensory organs, and every light it looked toward immediately exploded, plunging that section into darkness. "We're losing the perimeter," Isabel said, her voice shaking as she watched safe zones blink out one by one. "If the lights fail completely, if the safe zones are compromised, there's nowhere left to hide." Daniel's mind raced, thinking through everything he'd learned through 3 months, all the rules and protocols and accumulated wisdom. And then he remembered something Corso had said during his first night, about the rules being refined over generations, about them evolving to meet new challenges. The abandoned control booth. Rule 2, we have to keep lights on there constantly. Why? What is its purpose? Isabel's eyes widened with understanding. It's not just about keeping something in, it's about maintaining a focal point, a stable anchor that whatever exists here can't corrupt. If that light has been burning continuously since 1998, it's had decades to establish itself as an immutable part of the yard's infrastructure, something that even the otherworldly entities have to respect. Can you redirect power, make it brighter, expand its protective radius? Her fingers were already moving across the controls. There's an emergency system designed for evacuation scenarios. It was installed after the 2003 blackout incident, but never tested, because testing it would mean deliberately turning off the lights. I can trigger it remotely, flood the abandoned booth with maximum illumination, and hope the cascade effect extends far enough to reinforce the failing safe zones. The entity on track 5 had begun moving, its impossible limbs carrying it toward the maintenance bay where James Hartley was trapped. The darkness followed it like a cloak, extinguishing lights in its wake, shrinking the remaining safe zones with each passing second. "Do it," Daniel said. "We're out of options." Isabel pulled up the emergency controls, her hand hovering over the activation command. "If this doesn't work, if the old booth isn't the anchor point we think it is, we'll have diverted power from the remaining safe zones for nothing. People will die. If we don't try, people will definitely die. The entity is heading straight for Hartley, and the safe zones are failing anyway." She pressed the button. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The entity continued its inexorable advance, now within 20 yards of the maintenance bay. Then, from across the yard, light erupted from the abandoned control booth with an intensity that turned night into day. Not just normal illumination, but something purer, more fundamental, a radiance that seemed to push back against the darkness itself. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entity on track 5 recoiled, its impossible form writhing as though the light caused it physical pain. The failing safe zones stabilized, their lights surging back to full strength. And most remarkably, the twisted rails on track 5 began to straighten, reality reasserting itself, the breach sealing as though it had never existed. The entity retreated, its form diminishing and fragmenting, breaking apart into shadows that fled toward the unlit periphery of the yard. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, and the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the junction lifted like fog burning away under morning sun. The radio crackled to life, Corso's voice filled with barely controlled relief. "Control booth, report. What just happened?" Isabel's hands were shaking as she keyed the microphone. "We activated the emergency lighting protocol for the abandoned booth. It worked, Vincent. It reinforced the boundaries, drove back whatever was breaking through. The breach is sealed." There was a long silence, then Corso's voice returned, thoughtful and measured. "Then we need to add a new rule to the protocols. Rule 14. In the event of a Code 13 breach, activate emergency lighting at the abandoned control booth immediately. The old traditions adapt, as they always have. Over the following hours, as dawn approached and the supernatural activity ebbed with the coming daylight, the night crew gathered in the break room to debrief. They were exhausted, shaken, but alive. Raymond Cross, the real one, thanked Daniel and Isabel for their quick thinking, his gratitude profound despite his typically taciturn nature. "You did what Catherine Voss would have done. You saw a new threat, reasoned out a solution based on existing knowledge, and created a new protocol that future crews can follow. That's how we survive here, how we've always survived. Adaptation without abandoning the core principles." As the first gray light of dawn began to penetrate the darkness, Daniel stood outside the break room watching the train yard transform from a realm of shadows and whispers back into an ordinary industrial facility. The day shift would arrive soon, unaware of how close they'd come to losing several night workers, unaware of the battle that had been fought to maintain the fragile boundary between worlds. "The trains may be powered by diesel," he remembered the phrase from his first night, "but in the dead of night, some forces still run on whispers, forces that demanded respect, that required vigilance, that couldn't be conquered but could be coexisted with through careful adherence to rules written in the blood and terror of those who came before." He pulled out his phone, opening a note-taking app, and began documenting every detail of the night's events, not for any official report, but for the unofficial handbook that would be passed to the next generation of night workers, the next guardians of the rules. Because the whispering train yard would still be here long after he was gone, still operating under its dual nature, ordinary by day and otherworldly by night. And as long as there were workers willing to learn the rules, to respect the boundaries, to maintain the traditions, the trains would keep running on schedule. Both the trains that appeared on manifests and the ones that didn't. Both the workers who clocked in and out and the ones who walked the rails in forms that were no longer quite human. The line between worlds remained thin at Blackwood Junction, but it held. For now.